I don't want to be the kind of person who says they're vegan, but who delights at the chance to eat cheese pizza, pepperoni and cheese pizza, for free because someone else paid for it. I refuse to use cocaine, not for the sake of the cocaine, not for the sake of indirect consequences for the economy of Belize or Colombia. I refuse to use cocaine because of who I am. There's a judgment here on the perpetrator. I don't want to be a crackhead. And on the contrary, I actively want to be the kind of person who uniformly and consistently refuses to use cocaine. If you have the opportunity to rape someone, quote unquote, without consequences, like these rapists I've described, where it won't have these consequences, would you jump at the chance to take that opportunity? If so, there's a judgment on you that stands or falls independent of the consequences. There's a question of who you are and who you aspire to be. If you don't want to be a rapist, it doesn't mean you only rape people sometimes or when you can get away with it or when the consequences are limited. It means you're committed to never committing rape. If you do not support slavery, it means you don't participate in slavery even a little bit, and you take that opportunity to stand up and say, no, I'm going to stand up again. I'm not going to be a part of this. If you are vegan, it means you refuse to use animal products, even when even when you're not paying for it, even when someone else pays for it.
À-bas-le-ciel.
This video opens with an historical analogy, and then we get straight to the point. I read the autobiography of a Christian preacher, a Protestant, a white man who went from Europe to North America, and then from North America to what is today Myanmar, then the British colony of Burma. He was a brilliant linguist. He learned many of the local languages. He actually wrote hymns. He wrote songs for local people to sing that converted them to Christianity. Hardworking man with a brilliant mind. Shame that he used it to such a bad purpose. But of course, in his way, he was a man very much committed to his own morality. A moral code I disagree with, but a moral code nevertheless. When he was living there in Myanmar, of course, in very, very hard conditions over 100 years ago, much tougher than anything we endure today, he received gifts from supporters all around the world who learned about the work he was doing through Christian missionary bulletins, newspapers, and this sort of thing. And every so often, he'd receive handmade gifts from the southern United States, woven baskets, or what have you. And every single time, despite the poverty and difficulty he lived in, despite his remote location, he made the effort to pack them up in boxes and ship them all the way back to the United States, wherever it was they'd come from, with a note explaining that he does not accept gifts from slave owners, that he does not accept gifts that are made by slaves. In many ways, from my perspective, he was a man whose whole life was devoted to taking free people and making them into slaves, destroying their culture, destroying their language, destroying their independence, and converting them to a foreign ideology that, in a very abstract sense, is slavery. But he was standing up on point of moral principle. Now, the people I've been debating with lately, I can't believe this is a controversial issue. They might question, well, what harm is actually done by the basket itself? If you use this basket, you're not enslaving anyone, you're not torturing anyone, you're not directly approving of or endorsing slavery, are you? It is, from my perspective, completely surreal that in the year 2018, I've had this passionate response from vegans who've stood up one after another and tried to defend the idea that vegans can and should wear leather, that vegans can and should wear the dismembered corpses of dead animals, so long as it is secondhand, so long as, for example, it's a hand-me-down, that your older brother bought it, tried it on, decided it didn't look good on him, and then he hands it to you to wear. As long as someone else gets the unique bad karma that they imagine is attached to the act of buying the item, they think there is no magical bad karma attached to owning and using the item in perpetuity. And that, from my perspective, is really laughable and surreal. Now, I've already made a video that I think covers most of my point. And the level of controversy, the number of people who've wanted to dispute this with me at some length and some depth, this is the most controversial subject on my channel in that sense. It's most controversial, measuring the controversy by the number of vegans who really wanted to dispute with me. The most controversial since my first comments on vivisection. When I made my first comments on vivisection, there were many people who were furious and really wanted to talk to me and made a lot of videos reminding me and so on. The difference is vivisection is really a deep, worthwhile issue to discuss within the movement. And many, many people say that, including outright abolitionists like Gary Francione. Gary Francione does acknowledge that abolition of vivisection and animal experimentation for science, for scientific research, is ethically different and more complex than the use of animals for circuses, food, leather, etc. I've seen him say that in interviews with journalists, giving almost verbatim the same answer again and again. There's something there that's really worth talking about. And this topic, secondhand leather and secondhand morality, there is no depth to it. There is no complexity to it. There's nothing here worth debating. That's why it stuns me that people have been getting in touch with me to talk to me at length, basically demanding that I repeat the same points again and again, the same simple definitions again and again. Because all that my argument relies on is the understanding that if you are a vegan, therefore you regard the use of animal products as bad, as something to be avoided. So therefore, using leather is something bad, it's something to be avoided, assuming you're not abandoned on a desert island, assuming you're not in a situation where you will freeze to death unless you wear this leather coat. That's not what we're debating. We're talking about this within veganism. This is the status of secondhand leather within veganism. And the counter-arguments that are presented to me are really surreal. They're bad and misguided in and of themselves, and they lead to necessary absurdities. So I've been asking these people hypothetical questions that are not terribly hypothetical. Like, well, if you have two men, let's say you have two identical brothers, and they both show up at a vegan protest wearing fur coats, but one of them says, "Oh, don't worry, I got the coat for free. I got it secondhand," or "it was a hand-me-down from my grandmother." And the other one says, "Oh, I bought it. I paid cash. I ordered it," or whatever. You really think this is different? They are men wearing leather coats. In this case, fur coats, what have you. The only thing my argument rests on is the very basic concept that wearing a leather coat is still wearing a leather coat. Using fur, using animal products, or using animals is still using animals, whether or not you have this excuse for it, whether or not you were removed from the moral act, the moral decision of choosing to buy that product by one or two stages, whether it's because you got it secondhand, or because you got it as a hand-me-down for your brother, or what have you. So the counter-argument must be, and this is what I've challenged people to say, is what is the difference you see between these two identical twin brothers? And again, I've had to ask people, would you yourself go to a vegan protest wearing a fur coat, and then when other vegans are alarmed, explain, "Oh no, don't worry, it's secondhand"? What possible sense could your moral paradigms make if they lead to these kinds of excuses, these kinds of absurd situations? And that you see a deep ethical difference between two men, again, identical in all other respects, who are both wearing fur coats or wearing leather coats, but one of them paid himself, and in the other case, he got it for free from his brother. I mean, if someone else made this immoral decision, what's the decision you're making in participating in it? What's the decision you're making in benefiting from it? And that's what brings us back to this simple example of the Christian missionary in Myanmar. He's making a decision. He's not going to participate in slavery. He's not going to benefit from slavery, even though admittedly he is many stages removed from directly exploiting the slaves, or killing someone, putting someone in chains, kidnapping someone, or raising someone's children as indentured servants, or what have you. He's not involved in any of that. But he's putting his foot down and saying, no, he supports the abolition of slavery. Therefore, he's not going to participate in or benefit from slavery. We support the abolition of factory farming and of the factory leather industry and so on as different stages of that same industry. Therefore, we're not going to participate in this. Now, another illustration of this that, again, none of the people debate with have had any terribly good answer to was, Why is it that we regard it as immoral for a human being to wear a t-shirt that approves of Adolf Hitler or approves of the Holocaust? That's not too terribly hypothetical. We just had a whole bunch of people wearing t-shirts like that and holding up flags like that at an infamous protest that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. So there's been quite a lot of political discussion about that. What is the meaning? What's the significance of that? Well, wearing a t-shirt of that kind, whereas just wearing a t-shirt with a political slogan on it doesn't in any way causally involve you in the atrocities of the Holocaust. Nevertheless, there's the fact of wearing this, the fact of voicing your approval in this form, has an ethical significance that everyone can recognize. So why would it be difficult for vegans within the vegan movement to see the problem with a t-shirt stating a slogan of this kind, and yet to refuse to see the significance of actually wearing the dismembered pieces of animals' bodies? Now, there is an answer to this question. And the answer is that these people believe in a doctrine which is sometimes called utilitarianism and sometimes called consequentialism. In the context of this conversation, they boil down to the same thing. I've realized those words do not have the same meaning, but they pertain to this question in the same way. Now, I'm going to put in a trigger warning here. If this hasn't been disturbing enough for you, we're going to get into some really disturbing examples, psychologically disturbing. If you believe in consequentialism, you believe in judging the ethics of an action by its consequences, by its outcomes. And in many instances, that is very plainly evil, in my opinion. And within the vegan movement, it leads to absurd contradictions, conclusions, and excuse-making. Excuse-making that is so strictly parallel to the excuses that meat eaters make for eating meat that, frankly, it blows my mind any of these vegans can take themselves seriously when offering these excuses for wearing secondhand leather, or indeed, I should add, when they make these same excuses for eating secondhand meat. Every single one of these people who supports wearing secondhand leather would also stand by eating meat or eating cheese in circumstances where you didn't pay for it. So again, this is freeloading. This is free riding on someone else's bad decision. So a very real world scenario. One of the people I talked to is a university student. So he's often in situations at a university meeting where someone else has bought a pizza for everyone to share. Let's say there's both meat and cheese on the pizza. It's a pepperoni pizza, and everyone can have a slice for free. And he thinks there's no moral significance to him as a vegan eating meat and cheese. He thinks that's morally neutral just because he didn't purchase it. Again, the instance of the basket made by slaves. So you think that simply because this basket was given to you, you didn't enslave the people. You're not participating in, you're not benefiting from slavery by using the basket. Again, basket's a very remote example compared to eating the bodies of dead animals. It's mind blowing to me. This perspective, consequentialism, entails certain absurdities. Precisely because it shifts the locus of our judgment to the consequences, to the outcomes, which may be quite irrelevant to the moral character of the person making the decision or doing the act. I have heard 2 cases in depth of men who committed rape against women. Again, every possible trigger warning. You might want to close the video now. This is going to disturb you. Men who committed rape against women, and the women were completely unaware, and they had no psychological consequences or distress because they didn't even know what had happened until the police contacted them and presented with evidence. In one of the cases, the man had filmed himself committing the crime, and then indeed this was used to convict him. And the woman who was the victim, she had absolutely no memory of it. Drugs were involved. In another case, the man was a surgeon. So again, he had the drugs used to put someone to sleep to endure surgery. So they had no physical experience. They had no side effect, no harm, no psychological consequences. So you can compare 2 different rapists or 3 different rapists. We can come up with different scenarios where the consequences are utterly, utterly different. In one case, there was trauma and the woman's life is destroyed. Why don't we add pregnancy in one case, that the rape results in pregnancy and changes the whole woman's life forever in all kinds of ways, psychologically, physically, economically. And then you have another case where absolutely nothing changes them. There are no consequences. This rape was committed, and if the videotape had been lost, let's say hypothetically, she would have never known. There would have been no negative side effects for her whatsoever. A true consequentialist, someone who really believes in this form of utilitarian thinking, of judging actions by their consequences, would judge these two rapists differently. In fact, strictly speaking, if you believe in the well-being centered model of utilitarianism, you might even have to regard one of them as neutral or good, but at a minimum, one would be much less evil than the other. To me, that is irrelevant, because when I'm judging a case of rape, I'm not judging the victim. I'm judging the perpetrator. I'm judging the decision that person made. And in many Western countries, on many schools of law, the rapist who in this way completely got away with the crime, where they left no awareness on the part of the victim was drugged in such a way, whether by a surgeon or otherwise, that it had none of these negative consequences, they may be more guilty. They may face a much sterner sentence precisely because the method used here reflects very clear premeditation. This person took responsibility. They made this decision. It wasn't spontaneous. They weren't drunk or distracted. There were no other possible excuses here to mitigate it. They will probably get a worse sentence. They will probably get a fuller sentence. They'll get more punishment than someone in some other circumstances that didn't show, for example, premeditation. Many Western cultures, not all, premeditation leads to the crime being judged more harshly, right? Judged or sentenced, I should say. And indeed, it may be a slightly different charge than other circumstances that are dealt with. Okay, so consequentialism and utilitarianism lead to absurdities. Within veganism, right now, one of the main proponents of this, who I've criticized in many videos on my channel, is Unnatural Vegan. And her version of utilitarianism and consequentialism, she uses both terms to describe herself, leads her to make excuses for drinking milk as long as it's produced by a cow that's happy, eating meat. She will literally eat meat if she orders food and the waiter brings her the wrong order. So again, this is like secondhand leather, secondhand meat, secondhand cheese. She accepts that as vegan. So we now have a rationale for vegans eating. And again, put this into context in terms of the emotional and psychological reality. So if you order a vegan soup, I don't know, let's say you order a vegan minestrone soup, and you don't even say you're vegan. It's just, it's on the menu, it's vegan. And the waiter happens to bring you a pork dumpling soup. What's the mentality of this so-called vegan who subscribes to utilitarianism and consequentialism? Are they say, oh, great, oh, goody, oh, wonderful, here's my opportunity to eat pork? Because in their mind, they've justified this, they've vindicated this action by saying that if they don't eat it, it'll go into the garbage. They consider that a waste. I do not. I differ from this whole line of thinking, root and branch, as I've already said in an earlier video. So they might as well just use this animal product. They might as well just benefit from the immoral act someone else did. Same way, again, you want to benefit from the fact that your brother bought a leather coat, your grandmother bought a fur coat, and they gave it to you for whatever. You got it secondhand. You didn't pay, but you still want to benefit. I mean, if you, again, the basket made by slaves, and the significance, the moral significance of refusing to use the basket. In refusing to use the basket, you're putting your foot down and saying, I will not be a part of slavery. Now, I understand from a consequentialist perspective, you say, well, if you're just using the basket, are you really a part of slavery? If you're wearing a leather jacket, I don't have to reach for this concept of indirect consequences, whether through the free market or psychology or what have you. I'm not really concerned about, the perception of others and, your self-perception, how you feel about yourself. Something. If you're wearing a leather jacket, my argument is simply that you are wearing a leather jacket. And the fact that in your mind you have this excuse that you didn't pay for it, your brother paid for it, is immaterial. It's irrelevant. That is, in plain English, simply not good enough. Now, I say this, with all due humility. There are circumstances. You're freezing to death on a desert island. There is literally no other clothing you possibly. There are some excuses that are good enough. Okay, that's not one of them. somebody else paid is not one of them, right? Now, why do I use these examples? That from some perspectives, I've just been talking to people who really don't get how these examples are related. Ultimately, the judgment about rape doesn't have to do with the consequences for the victim. As I say, because I'm not judging the victim, I'm judging the perpetrator. We're judging, is this man a rapist? Is he guilty of rape? Okay? If you wear a leather jacket, you're wearing a leather jacket. You're engaged in animal use. It's like I said before, if it's a horse, I don't care that you didn't buy the horse. The fact that you keep it in captivity and ride it, that's it. This is use. Veganism is opposed to all use of animals. But so if you identify as a vegan, you are therefore a hypocrite in wearing a leather jacket or a fur jacket or eating the pizza that someone else purchased for you, right? Ultimately, this isn't a judgment about indirect consequences. It's not a judgment of indirect consequences for the victim of the rape. It's not a judgment about indirect consequences like by accepting this basket made by a slave, are you somehow perpetuating the cycle of slavery on that slave plantation? No. It doesn't rely on any of these things. The question is about you as a person making the decision of who you are. And that, for me, is what links this, the question of whether or not you refuse to wear secondhand leather, whether or not you'd refuse a basket made by slaves, whether or not you'd refuse a lampshade made out of human skin, something that really happened during World War II in the concentration camps. They did make lamps out of human skin. Whether or not you'd refuse to wear leather, whether or not you'd refuse to be an accessory to rape, whether or not you'd refuse to use cocaine. Ultimately, I refuse to use cocaine, not for the sake of the cocaine, not for the sake of indirect consequences for the economy of Belize or Colombia. I refuse to use cocaine because of who I am. There's a judgment here on the perpetrator. I don't want to be a crackhead. And on the contrary, I actively want to be the kind of person who uniformly and consistently refuses to use cocaine. I don't want to be the kind of person who says they're vegan, but who delights at the chance to eat cheese pizza, pepperoni and cheese pizza, for free because someone else paid for it. If I did that in a very meaningful sense, I would be a different person. That would be a different moral and ethical identity for who I am. If you have the opportunity to rape someone, quote unquote, without consequences, like these rapists I've described, where it won't have these consequences, would you jump at the chance to take that opportunity? If so, there's a judgment on you that stands or falls independent of the consequences. There's a question of who you are and who you aspire to be. If you don't want to be a rapist, it doesn't mean you only rape people sometimes or when you can get away with it or when the consequences are limited. It means you're committed to never committing rape. If you do not support slavery, it means you don't participate in slavery even a little bit, and you take that opportunity to stand up and say, no, I'm going to stand up again. I'm not going to be a part of this. If you are vegan, it means you refuse to use animal products, even when even when you're not paying for it, even when someone else pays for it. It means you take that stand, which is not that hard to take. You say to your brother, look, if you give me this secondhand leather garbage, you say to your brother, I understand you're trying to give me this leather jacket. It's secondhand. You think I can use it, and you can't anymore. If you give me this jacket, I'm going to throw it in the garbage because my moral position is that that's where this belongs. I don't think that the body parts of animals are clothing for me to wear. If you invite me to a party where someone else paid for cheese pizza, if you insist on giving me a piece of pepperoni pizza, I'm going to put it in the garbage because from my perspective, ethically, that's where it belongs. I'm not going to participate in the exploitation of death in animals. Ecologically, ethically, in terms of health, I have all these reasons. And the fact that someone else paid for it, it may matter. It may be a significant moral consideration in many ways. But as I said before, the lesser of two evils is still evil. The fact that it might be less evil for me to eat a pizza when someone else paid for it, or for me to wear a leather jacket when someone else bought it, doesn't mean that it's not wrong.
À-bas-le-ciel.